Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you across the United States to our national virtual town hall on civil and human rights in the era of pandemic and protests. This town hall is being brought to you by the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which we refer to by its acronym IAOHRA. IAOHRA is the only national network of the multitude of human and civil rights agencies based in state, county, city governments throughout the United States. My name is Robin Toma, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles County, where I serve as the Executive Director of our county's Human Relations Commission. I also have the honor of serving as President of IAOHRA, and it's in that role as well that I have the honor of opening this gathering with all of you and our special guests, who are accomplished leaders and voices in the field of civil and human rights, known nationally and internationally. IAOHRA and its outstanding board of directors decided to do this for its members and other allies because we're clearly in extraordinary times. The unprecedented combination of a global pandemic, along with the social quarantine and economic impact that we've been experiencing, all of it exposing and causing longstanding inequities. We're in the throes of a widespread uprising that has the potential of deep changes to our criminal justice systems, of redefining policing as we know it, and of undermining the structural racism that has so long perpetuated injustices in this country. In this climate, our member agencies have a special responsibility to advance equity and positive intergroup relations and uphold and advance civil and human rights laws throughout the United States. And just looking at our member agencies of IAOHRA alone, we do this for over 250 million people. Today, IAOHRA's purpose is to give all of us the opportunity to step back and step up, to see from a higher plane what's at stake for our precious and fundamental civil and human rights, especially in these extraordinary times of the global pandemic that's COVID-19, and amidst the protests and uprisings that are going on throughout our nation and the world. Our goal is to provide you with a chance to see the big picture through the eyes and wisdom of national and international leaders in both thought and action in our field. We want to also give you knowledge and perspectives that can help to inform your strategy on the ground so we can be more effective and coordinated in the struggle. We want to take huge steps forward in this lifelong journey to true equity and social justice. Let me give you some practical information. We invite you to submit questions for panelists via the chat function, which is on the bottom of your screen. And IAOHRA board members will be gathering that information and providing it to our moderator and me so we can pose them to our guests. So with that, I'm happy to introduce our moderator for today, a friend, a man who has brought me onto the board of this great organization, IAOHRA. But most importantly, today he is not just a former IAOHRA president, but the national chair of the NAACP, to which he was elected in 2017. He and NAACP have long been a leading voice in civil and human rights for our nation. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Mr. Leon Russell, coming to us from Florida, DC, Hawaii, not sure.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Robin. And I'm coming to you from Tampa, Florida. In the world of COVID-19, we don't travel a lot these days. Before I get into some preliminary remarks, I want to introduce to everyone the folks who are going to be talking to us and talking with us this afternoon. We have Derek Johnson, and folks, let me say this before I start the introductions. Even though these are short introductions, I'm going to make them shorter so that we have lots of time to talk. I think everyone is very capable and has been educated properly and at esteemed institutions. And so I'm going to tell you who they are, and then I'll make some remarks, and then we'll get into the questions and answers. So we have Derek Johnson, National President and Chief Executive Officer of the NAACP, a position he's held since October 2017. And I can tell you he was holding it a little bit before that, but we won't go there. We have Dr. Camara Phyllis Jones, who is a family physician and epidemiologist whose work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on health and well-being of the nation. She is a past president of the American Public Health Association, and she is well placed to talk to us about the pandemic. We have Stuart Quo, who is a founder and past president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. Advancing Justice LA, an organization he co-founded in 1983. He's nationally recognized as an expert on race relations, Asian American studies, nonprofit organization, philanthropies, civil rights, and legal services. We have Brian Levin. Brian is the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism and a professor of criminal justice at California State University. He specializes in the analysis of hate crime, terrorism, and legal issues. And he used to be a writer for the Journal of Intergroup Relations, the IAOHRA publication. We have Catherine Lehman, who is chair of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, a position to which she was appointed in 2016 by then President Obama. She also serves in the cabinet of California Governor Gavin Newsom, where she has been Legal Affairs Secretary since 2019. Jim wrote these introductions, so whatever. Lisa Rice is the president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, NAFA, leading efforts by NAFA and its partners to advance fair housing principles and to preserve and broaden fair housing protections and expand equal housing opportunities for millions of Americans. I'll talk about me. Lastly, we have Robin Thoma, who is the president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies and executive director of the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations. He also serves as head of the Human Relations branch, holding the position of assistant director of the Department of Workforce Development. With that, just briefly, I want to talk about the fact that we are in unprecedented times to the extent that we have to operate in first the COVID-19 environment, an infectious disease that has really impacted every part of the nation, whether people want to admit it or not. It's a serious, life-threatening, debilitating disease that we all need to understand and figure out how we can deal with it in this present situation. On top of that, we're dealing with a not final, but for me, a new nationwide recognition and also worldwide recognition that racism in America is in fact its own pandemic. And that once and for all, as a nation, the United States of America, Maya Angelou might say, these as yet United States of America, have an obligation to face the racism that has impacted every facet of life for people of color in this nation since its founding and before. So those two things coming together create a situation that is rife with danger, but I think it also is an opportunity for us to move ahead. It presents new opportunities. We've seen the development of what I consider to be a new movement born out of the realization that racism is real. and that public policy can kill you. It's important for us to understand that as we move about and we do our jobs, we need to reflect on the fact that public policy is made by human beings. It's impacted by the environment that we live in and the history of the nation. A nation whose public policy has been, in many instances, impacted by white supremacy, a feeling of superiority, and a real racist attitude. That system has developed, showing implications of those things. And it is most vividly demonstrated in this twin pandemic when we think about the fact that COVID-19 impacts communities of color at a greater rate than any other part of our society. We have to ask why. And it's because of the impact of systemic racism on our healthcare system, on our housing system, on our economic system, and all of the other facets. That's what leads us to the place that we find ourselves today. And that's the discussion that we need to have. I would also go back to IAOHRA's own history. IAOHRA didn't just spring up. It was birthed out of a need after World War II in many communities to deal with the issues of race that were exacerbated by returning Black soldiers to their communities after having fought Nazism and white supremacy abroad, returning home, only have to face it every day of their lives. We saw communities develop. You can call them good of the community committees and all kinds of things, but they morphed into local human rights commissions or human relations commissions or community relations commissions across the country. That movement grew as we moved into the 50s, and we saw the civil rights movement growing across the country. More and more of these agencies were created. Some of them were just that. They were voluntary organizations that tried to use persuasion and education as a way of changing things. Others were given strict enforcement authority to deal with issues of discrimination in employment, in housing, and in education. And so that grouping of issues has led the development of IAOHRA over the years, and the membership has grown, ebbed and flowed based on the nation's attention to issues of race, issues of community relations. I think it's true to say that many of our agencies have suffered because of what I consider benign neglect. The fact that people thought, well, it's all right now. We don't really need these agencies. But every time folks start to burn down the town, we see a renewed interest in human relations and community relations. And for that, we are in the middle of a great crisis. And the question is, what will our human rights and human relations commissions do to respond to this crisis? With that, the question that I have overarching for everyone is, in light of an international pandemic and the most recent display of police brutality, racial profiling, and law enforcement overreach, resulting in the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna, and the civil unrest that has resulted, how has this affected your organization's vision and mission, and how will your organization be implementing its policies, procedures, and plans to reach its ultimate goal? And please give us 3 concrete examples. And I would hope that you would use that as a platform for an opening presentation. And please try to keep it to 3 minutes each. I want to start with Derek. And just to give you a little clue, Catherine, I'll be coming to you next. Derek?
Well, good afternoon, and I was hoping you were starting with Catherine first, as I've managed a campaign with the Miss End. First of all, I want to thank everyone for allowing me the opportunity to join this conversation. The NAACP have been working hard to respond to this moment. It's a moment of both health uncertainty, as well as an awakening that structural racism actually exists in America. And that awakening has been shocking to some and a good opportunity for others. Shocking to some, because anytime corporate America wake up one morning and say, you know, racism is a problem, it really takes many of us aback because the social construct of race has also been one of the primary motivators to drive economics. It's a money proposition. It is not only a value proposition, it's a money proposition. And the whole nature of creating otherness, it allows for the exploitation of labor. And for African Americans, we know that also well. And so we are in this moment of a health pandemic where there was a captive audience to witness what many of us in the African American community have always known, that African Americans have been treated with the level of dehumanization that no human being on the planet should be confronted with. And it was captured on camera, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, 11 different angles, where people who were stuck in their home because of the health pandemic seeing firsthand the reality. And that sparked something different. And it's different because when you look at the peaceful protest, it is the face of America. It's Black, it's white, it's young, it's old, male, females, calling for justice in a system that proclaimed justice, but has demonstrated injustice for far too many decades and centuries for so many. And that's on top of this corporate awakening that racism is a problem. And I think they see it as a problem because it's bad for business. And understanding that the capital proposition in this moment is one in which many corporations have to begin to recalibrate, rethink where they are. And one of the distractions that I will be having during this call is a campaign that we have launched to address racism on that platform we call Facebook, and calling corporate America to task around their ad purchasing on this behemoth of a company that's almost like that is a public utility, is a single source provider, and there are no levers of accountability because there are no regulatory controls, there are no consumer controls because it's so large. The only thing we can do is get corporate America, who's acknowledged racism exists, to begin to suspend their ad buy on the platform until some guardrails are put in place, particularly for the white supremacist groups that use the platform for recruitment and carrying out domestic violence. There's no other way to put it, to carry out domestic violence on top of the subverting of our democracy, because it was this platform who also allowed a foreign nation and a political party to mislead individuals to suppress the vote in 2016. But the junctures of the cultural realities that we're seeing across America in the streets, and the juncture of a corporate acknowledgement that structural racism exists, lead us to November, where we can actually make some change to move from protest to power of the vote, and from the power of the vote to policy changes to address systemic and structural racism. And in this moment, it gives us that opportunity to do something that I have not seen us to do in my lifetime. And if we do this correctly, we can actually drive the conversation to the America that we think should be as the America that was. But we will only be able to do that if we stay focused in the energy in the street. And the next real march that we have must be in November. And it must be in November with all of our nonpartisan hats to ensure that the value proposition of equal protection under the law is heard loud and clear, so the policymakers elected carry that value proposition to the next ultimate state, and that's policy implementation. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the conversation.
Catherine?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Leon. Thank you all to my fellow panelists. It's really such a pleasure to join you all in this very important conversation. As Leon described for IAOHRA, not having grown out of nowhere and having a long history of work in these areas, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which I chair, likewise has a 6-decade statutory charge from Congress to advise Congress, the President, and the American people about civil rights policy. And it will not be surprising to anyone participant in this webinar that police use of force has been a recurrent concern for the Commission over the 6 decades that we have been in existence. And we very recently issued a report again about the civil rights implications of police use of force and making recommendations for the country about how we can avoid the moment that we're in, how we can do better to live up to our civil rights ideals, and how we can ensure that our communities are communities that benefit from effective policing that operates according to constitutional norms. We live now a time where we see again that that is not what is true for too many of us in too many of our communities. And we are living a time when our country is up in arms, upset about it, coming together to speak out and to call for change. I am grateful that the Commission has been able to lay out a blueprint for what we need. I'm very grateful that the House passed a bill yesterday that includes many of the recommendations that the Commission includes and cites the Commission's recommendations for what we need as a country. And I hope very much that we do see Congress take the action that we need to drive material change in our communities. I'm also so deeply grateful for the outpouring of commitment and the demonstration of commitment across the country in communities large and small, suburban, urban, rural, around the country to say, this is not what we expect of our police. This is not how we should be treated. Those are the right responses. Those are the right human responses. And we need to sustain that commitment so that we actually live what has long been the law, so that we actually live what has long been promised to all of our communities, but too many of us don't experience from our police. And that actually living up to those commitments would make our police safer, would make our communities safer, would allow all of us to live the civil rights and equity principles that we've long been promised. So to your question, Leon, about how what we are seeing in this moment now impacts the work of our organizations. For the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, this has been our charge for 6 decades. And it continues to be our very strong commitment across my fellow commissioners that we will be the nation's eyes and ears. We will call attention to what people actually experience and what they should be experiencing, what our civil rights policy should be. We have very concrete calls for material reform with respect to police use of force. We also have very concrete calls for reform in the pandemic that we live in this moment. And we are redoubling our commitment. We are continuing to promote what we have said about police use of force. We also are taking the moment as a commission to aggressively look at the COVID-19 impacts on many walks of life that we are experiencing, including voting rights and the federal commitment to our civil rights and for funding for Native American communities in the United States. So these are times that call on all of us to act with urgency, and frankly, all times call on all of us to act with urgency. So I am simultaneously grateful to see so much commitment around the country, and grateful to my colleagues for having been here and having been committed to stay here in practicing what we believe and setting out a blueprint for how best to live our civil rights ideals. I'll stop there, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Jones.
Hi, I am really delighted to be part of this group, and I'd like to frame my 3 minutes, first of all, by saying that I also since I've been working for decades on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation, I am so happy that so many people are now able to name racism, to say the word systemic racism, structural racism, to assert that Black Lives Matter. But I am fearful that this might just be another blip. And my intent is to not let the nation fall back into what I describe as the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial, which is our nation's staunch position right now. So in order for people not to fall back after they've acknowledged that racism exists, to not fall back into racism denial, everybody's going to have to need to act. So I'd like to frame my 3 minutes around three things. What is public health kind of doing? Where has public health been? I'd like to provide a brief definition of racism that might help clarify things for a lot of people, and to talk about a treaty. So I was president of the American Public Health Association 4 years ago, and I used that platform to launch our association, and as many other organizations and communities as would join us, on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism, which is the important thing, because you must name racism. If you do not, in the context of widespread denial, you're complicit with that denial. But naming racism is not enough. We have to figure out what are we going to do about it. So the second of the 3 tasks is to ask the question, how is racism operating here in my child's school, in this community, with regard to police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women? How is racism operating here? Looking at the mechanisms which are in our elements of decision-making, where structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And I always encourage people, whenever you find yourself at a decision-making table, to look around and say, who is not here, who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job is not just to represent their interests. Your job is to actually create space at the table, to find them a way to the table. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. And I have found it quite useful to take this question, and you can apply it anywhere, and you can generate a list of 5 to 50 possible mechanisms that require our intervention. The third of the 3 tasks, name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and then organize and strategize to act. So I am so encouraged by the mobilizations that we're seeing right now. The second thing I wanted to share is a definition of racism. I'm going to say it in one sentence and then just lift up a few points. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So the things to lift up is that racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw, personal moral failing, psychiatric illness. It does 2 things. It structures opportunity and it assigns value. It's based on so-called race, which is not biology. The 3 impacts, the unfair disadvantage. Every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. And so that's that, but then it's also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. It's not just that Black lives matter. Black lives are precious. Black lives are genius. Black lives are leaders. Black lives are generous and kind and loving and all of that, as are, lives of indigenous people and people of color. But racism, when it slowly constrains the lives of Black folks and other folks by not investing in the full excellent public education, or whether it's a quick snuffing, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of pushing the life out of a person. Every time that happens, it's not just the individual, it's not just the family or the community, the whole nation is sapped of its strength and power because of the waste of human resources. And then the last thing I want to say is, I'm so happy to be here with you guys who are working on this. Many people do not know that they've never heard of ICERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is an international anti-racism treaty that was adopted by the UN General Assembly in '65. The US signed it in '66. The US Senate ratified it 28 years later in 1994, and we have present-day obligations today to do right under this treaty, including submitting every 6 years or so, our State Department submits a report. We get concluding observations back. And the most recent concluding observations we got from the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination said, thank you for your report, United States. We remain concerned about racial profiling, disproportionate incarceration, the achievement gap in education, residential segregation, health disparities. And so and they not only remain concerned about, they have recommendations. So we as a nation need to use that platform to expand our efforts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And we've been asked if you will provide your definition of racism to IAOHRA so they can distribute it. Next, we are going to go to Stuart Quo.
Thank you, Leon. I appreciate being invited to this very important discussion. And just by way of background.
Stuart?
So I have a long history with the Human Relations Commissions, and I've worked with Robin for many, many years. I just wanted to give a specific example of the Asian American community, because we are confronting three simultaneous challenges. One is, like all Americans, we are trying to avoid the coronavirus. Number two, we are dealing with the murder of George Floyd and the movement for Black Lives, and the importance of using this moment for major changes. And the third is that we are tackling anti-Asian violence throughout the United States. There are over 2,300 hate incidents in just the last 3 months against Asian Americans around the country. And it is, they range from verbal altercations to stabbings, to beatings, and the President of the United States is encouraging bad behavior by calling this the Kung Flu, by calling it the Wuhan virus, by calling it the China virus. He is intentionally whipping up racism against Asian Americans around the country, even as of two to 3 days ago. So I want to talk about the two major changes that this has led in terms of my organization, to Leon's question. One is, we are tackling the anti-Asian violence by dealing with it head on. We have a Stand Against Hatred website. We are tracking, along with other groups, some of the violence. We have, we're in the process of hiring a program person who will look at these cases to see if any of them could rise to a case that we would take on. Secondly, we are uplifting through a series of PSAs the role of Asian Americans as frontline workers, whether they're the grocery store workers or the nurses or the doctors or the researchers. And thirdly, I just wanted to say, my wife is working on the curriculum from the PBS series that aired May 11th and 12th, the 5-hour documentary on Asian Americans. So we're doing all of that. The second major piece that we're doing is we are trying to confront the anti-Blackness and the anti-Black attitudes in the Asian American community. The Asian Americans, for the first 100 years of our being in the United States, were treated as Blacks. We were, in case after case, we were told we're not white, we are Black, we are mulattoes. And so whether it's testifying against whites in court, we could not. Whether we could become citizens of the United States, we could not. Whether we were interned during World War II, when Germans and Italian Americans were not, we were interned for 3 to 4 years in concentration camps in the United States of America. So I am trying to connect Asian American groups to Black groups, because has been a disengagement from dialogue, from connection, from discussion, like on affirmative action. There isn't the engagement of how we all benefit from affirmative action. There isn't that engagement. So I am trying to link African American, Black groups, and Asian American groups, because I believe that the Asian American community has to confront the anti-Black attitudes that exist within the community in concrete ways, in the connection, in the policies, and the voting that is going to be so important. So thank you for inviting me, and I will look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stuart. Brian, you're next. Lisa, you're coming.
Thank you so much. And let me just state again for the record, CCR Center stands with all our allies in this battle to preserve the dignity and lives of all Americans, but in particular at this moment for our Black friends and neighbors. Enough is enough. We now have an opportunity, a transformative time to take things that we've all talked about in our small groups and try to get the nation to join us. And I think that is a beautiful part of the moment. Some of these protests, social distance with my middle-aged man mask, it was unbelievable to see the young people who were leading the rest of the way in a multicultural, multiracial mandate for the moral calling of what this moment means. So thank you for letting me say that, because I was told I just talk about data all the time and I don't have a good heart or not as eloquent and articulate as all the other speakers. In my defense though, one of the first times I spoke at a NIRO event, as I said in the run-up, it was Congressman Clyburn and Congressman John Lewis and a preacher from Western North Carolina spoke before. So I felt that I am ineloquent and inarticulate. Let me tell you though what we're trying to do. First of all, we're trying to make sure that our independent analysis becomes available to all, but in particular to coordinate with those government agencies and specifically now state level as well, and not just here in California, but nationally. We've seen a 38% decline in hate crime prosecutions by the federal government, according to Voice of America, over the last couple of years. That's something. We've also saw the rollbacks with respect to the federal involvement with oversight of police departments. And of course, we are vigorously supporting, along with our friends at the NAACP and others, HR 7120. As Speaker Pelosi said, what are we going to do? Have a partial ban on chokeholds? I mean, come on. So that's some of what we're working on. But in particular, we're really trying to expand because the work has been a tidal wave. In particular, just today, the online space just today, two developments. One, Sean King has been targeted by some retired law enforcement for some kind of online plot, according to the Los Angeles Times. All Institute of Strategic Dialogue has found, many of us are finding that it's not only Facebook. There is an ecosystem where, like frogs jumping from lily pads, what we are seeing are white supremacists are part of a globalized movement which feeds on not only online associations, but political rhetoric that is occurring on social media along with conspiracy theories in their particular countries. So we're having this disturbing type of confluence. And we are working on a variety of things, including speaking with social media companies, as well as Congress about what they can do with respect to hate crime, online extremism, and extremism in the military, as we've seen just this week. Couple of plots, Boogaloo Boys out here in California, one assailant killed 2 police officers. Just the other week, we saw a plot to attack protesters, peaceful protesters in Las Vegas. And this week, we saw an online extremist leaking information to who was a member of the army, a member of the military rather, leaking information to extremist groups. So bottom line is we have our work cut out for us, but I think what we're going to try and concentrate are on these policies that we particular expertise, mostly with regard to hate crime, extremism, education. And one thing that I would ask people to ponder is, as we're looking at this pendulum swing, let's make sure that however law enforcement is going to be reformed, that we have several things, intersections with the community and HRCs, human relations commissions, and like-minded agents, as well as refunding CRS, Community Relations Service, of which IAOHRA and NIRA have played such a significant role with. And additionally, let's make sure we don't lose the ability to important data and policies and hate crime units and liaisons into whatever recipe comes out at the end. I just want to send a felt thank you to all my allies listening and on this panel, particularly from Civil Rights Commission. Stuart, wonderful work that you've been doing. Let me just say something about what we've been seeing. Hate crimes are down in most cities in the United States for the first part of the year. But what are we seeing? Increases in many, but not all cities in anti-Asian hate. And where are these occurring? In basically the same cities that we've seen with the Stop AAPI research. New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, these international cities that have some population density and influx and outflux of people internationally. Not all cities have we seen this, but real briefly, listen to this. If we just took the data and broke down just to assaults, that would be almost as much of all the anti-Asian hate crimes that we saw in the last FBI report. One last point, and we'll discuss it more a little later. Don't even worry about what happens in the half of a year. Whether, in this case, lockdown, stay at home, things like that, I think have impacted. But what have we seen? Increases in online hate, increases with regard to hate directed against our Asian American friends, family, and neighbors. And in election years, we have seen generally increases in the second half of the year. So 2016, November 2016 was the worst month for hate crime going back 14 years. But if you looked at the first part of the year, it would have been down to flat in most places. And that later part of the year surge lifted the hate crime data for the whole year. So that's what I would say. We'll talk more about that during the other part of this, but I wanted to thank everyone here. And also, if any of you have police data from your jurisdictions, feel free to send it to me at b118@aol.com. Also, on Prof. Levin, I will tweet later today some of the data that I talk about here in this discussion. So Prof. Levin, if you want to see some of that data, b118@aol if you have data from jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Lisa, housing.
Hi, Leon. It is such an honor. I'm so humbled to be on this panel and with you all here today. I really am humbled to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. You know, Leon, I think that we need to do two fundamental things. We have a short window of opportunity, and we have to seize this window to do two fundamental things. The first is to exact structural change. We have got to dismantle the structures that create and perpetuate bias and racism in our nation and replace them with systems that perpetuate and promote equality. And the second thing is we need cultural change. We need cultural change in our society. We need cultural change in our institutions. So at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we're doing three things that I'll just tease up now in order to help realize both structural change and cultural change. The first really centers around public policy reform in the housing and the finance sector, since that's our bailiwick. But we do that with a distinct understanding that housing cuts across. There is this deep intersectionality between housing and health, between housing and education, housing and criminal justice issues, housing and the environment. We do that with that fundamental understanding. Structural change starts with policy, and policy directs resources. So one of the things that we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic is the inextricable link, right, between health and housing. The more housing instability people have, the more susceptible they are to the virus. And we need resources at this time to support people in their housing stability so that they can safely remain at home and recover, and also so that they can take advantage of the other opportunities that may be available in their communities to help them through this very difficult period. So the HEROES Act is an example of that. We've built equity provisions in the HEROES Act, specifically relating to the housing and the finance components of the HEROES Act. So for example, it includes a moratorium on evictions. It includes funding for rental housing payment assistance, and that includes utilities and all other kinds of housing payments. We have created a homeowners assistance fund in the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act also includes a provision for providing 12 months of forbearance to all homeowners, not just those who have a government-backed loan. And the other thing that we've built into the HEROES Act is measures of transparency and accountability, right? So all of these programs that I've just mentioned that are contained in the HEROES Act carry with them a requirement to report on data along demographic lines so that we can have that transparency to hold people and communities that receive these resources accountable. We didn't have that in the CARES Act, but we've built it into the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act has passed the House. It is stymied in the Senate, and we need to get it out of the Senate. The Senate needs to pass the HEROES Act. The second thing that we're doing is an initiative called Keys Unlock Dreams, the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative. It's designed to specifically dismantle structural barriers in the housing and the lending markets. The racial homeownership gap is growing, and the racial wealth gap is growing. The racial wealth gap is tied directly to the homeownership gap. In fact, Leon, the racial homeownership gap has grown so much that the gap is back to where it was in 1890, not 1990, 1890. That's how much we have regressed when it comes to Black wealth and Black homeownership in America. So the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative is designed to reduce the growing racial wealth and homeownership gaps. And then the last initiative that we're announcing is a technology initiative to address algorithmic and tech bias in the housing and lending sectors. We have got to address technology bias. Derek alluded to this earlier. Many of you saw last year our groundbreaking precedent-setting settlement with Facebook, but it was just one sliver of what needed to be addressed on that platform. In our housing and finance sectors, as in many, many other areas, there is an increasing reliance on technology. Technology is not innocuous. It is not benign. Technology breeds, and in some cases, amplifies discrimination and bias. And we have to deal with technological bias if we are going to create a fair and equitable society.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. You raised some great questions. Brian did too, Stuart did, Derek did, and Catherine did. But we're going to jump now, Catherine. The question, the youth movement has settled in, as it appears. What makes this time different from past movements? Why now? As we have seen decades of social and political apathy.
You know, I want to start just by saying I'm not sure that what we saw in the past was apathy. This is a materially different time, partly because so many people are at home and partly because we have so much access to social media. And so people people have time to watch and also have ready at their fingertips with their cell phones access to videotaping and to seeing what is the lived experience and has been the lived experience for too many of us for so long. And this moment is a moment when we're seeing people harness that power and use it to great effect. I'm amazed, awestruck, pleased by the ways that our communities are insisting on coming together and insisting on showing what they live and showing what's positive and showing what's negative. I mean, and we certainly have seen both. As I assume many of us have been binge watching what is available on social media from people's cell phones, and that includes the incredible strength and fortitude of character for protesters coming out in a pandemic to say this has to end for us. This is the strength of our feeling about this. We're going to take a personal risk to come together and say no more, and then also to see the risk that they live. I mean, there's a video I think I will never forget of a teenage boy walking back to his car. He's Black, he's holding his sign, and he's walking past white people with guns who came out in the community to intimidate the protesters and to scare them. And the protesters had been made to take a nonlinear path to where they had parked their cars because it was unsafe. And they only made it to the cars because there were police officers there watching to make sure that those guns were not fired. But that is the kind of intimidation that we think of in the Bill Connor days, that we think of in our distant past when we knew, that we tell ourselves that we have grown, that we know better, and that times have changed. They have not changed for that child who came out to speak his truth and who was intimidated. They have not changed for example, what Stuart is describing, for the kinds of hate crimes that we're seeing around the country. This is obviously Professor Levin's livelihood. And so we know that kind of intimidation exists, but too often as a community, we tell ourselves that it's not our current truth. And one of the things that is materially different now is the ability to photograph it and then disseminate it in a way that is incredibly broad. That I think is incredibly powerful. And I'm hoping that it will spark continued insistence on change. What we in this webinar know is that equity is not a destination that we reach, we check box, and we move on. We always have to be vigilant about protecting our rights. We always have to be vigilant about the ways that we can be harmed. We don't have the luxury to assume that we will not be subject to that kind of intimidation that child experienced, that we have been able to witness because of the video. So I think what is different is technology. What is different is access to it and time that people have. I hope what will also be different is a persistent commitment that is nationwide to insistence on change. And I want to say I'm here for that. My commission is here for that. We will do our part to make sure that we actually live our civil rights ideals.
Absolutely. So, Catherine, I know you have a hard stop, so I'm going to ask you one additional question, but I want our other panelists to keep that youth question in mind because I'm coming to each of you on that. The U.S. Commission was founded in part to protect voting rights. Yes. What can IAOHRA and its member agencies and we as individuals do to ensure that voting rights aren't undermined in this critical period?
Thank you so much for that. We are 5 months away, which can feel like an eternity, but it is so not an eternity as we prepare for being able to practice our right to vote. What we are seeing in the COVID time, those elections that have taken place as recently as this week have involved pretty significant voter suppression, have involved pretty significant ways that we have asked people to take personal risk to be able to exercise what is core to democracy, which is the right to vote. We've seen people who are waiting in lines, in long lines. We've seen too few polling places open available to them. We've seen people insisting that you must be able to vote in person right now at a time when all across the country, the health recommendation, the public health recommendation is to stay home, is not to put yourself at risk, not to be with other people, but we are insisting on having people in close proximity for very long periods of time unnecessarily. So our first step, I hope all of us will commit to finding ways to exercise our right to vote in a way that is also safe. I'm very proud. I live in California. very proud that our governor has required that there be vote by mail available to every registered voter in November, so that people have a choice. They can vote by mail. They don't have to be in line. And for those of us who need to vote in person, we will also in the state have voting be open and available. I hope that we will see more of that around the country, but I'm deeply dismayed by the kinds of things I'm seeing from many states and from our federal government saying, well, if you can go get a cupcake, you can go vote. That, first of all, however much I love cupcakes, and I do, the right to vote is core to us as Americans, is core to being able to exercise democracy. So we need to protect that, and we need to protect it in a way that is safe. What we know as the commission is that there will be, and there have been, repeat kinds of efforts to stop some of us from being able to vote. So the commission is redoubling our efforts on this. We issued a comprehensive report about the status of voting rights in 2018. And in the COVID-19 pandemic, we are coming back to look at how the COVID-19 context has itself implicated danger to the right to vote. To your specific question, Leon, about what all of us can do, I hope we will share information about polling place changes, about actually voting and the need to vote and how to vote in our communities. We will encourage all of us to vote. There's too many of us who think it's not worth it, that my vote doesn't count. Every vote counts. Every vote matters. And we should be doing our part to ensure opportunities to keep those votes safe and to make sure that people don't have to be in person, don't have to take personal risk, and can participate. And then my last point is just that each of us can do voter protection work. Each of us can go to the polls, can participate in sharing information, and can be witnesses to what kind of change needs to happen. And I know at the commission, we deeply believe in shining spotlight on harm, because that spotlight and that attention to it causes change. So I encourage each of us to do our part to protect that right to vote. That includes voting yourself, encouraging others to vote, and then participate in voter protection efforts. Thank you.
So thank you, Catherine, for your leadership of the U.S. Commission. We look forward to your work, and we appreciate your participation on behalf of IAOHRA. I know that all of the member agencies are looking to you for leadership, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that the rest of this webinar continues well. I'm sorry I have to leave.
All right, thank you. Gonna go now back to the youth question. Derek, the NAACP has a strong youth movement, but why is it so important now, and what will make this different?
I think what's different now for our young people is the speed in which information is received and disseminated, the speed in which the response takes place. Oftentimes not as structured as we are used to, but in many times the need of the moment. Social media has created the space where news is more democratized than any time than ever before. Any young person or any person with a smartphone become an instant reporter. Individuals on different social platforms have larger audiences than some of our local news, have viewership in a particular area. And in some cases, some of the influencers have larger audience than ABC, NBC, or CBS nightly news. So that's a different reality for us, just that whole democratization of media. In the past, we would be captive to editors in the newsroom that would try to create a narrative around the story, and those parameters were all many times limiting, oftentimes came with embedded biases and racism that was in there. With social media, allow for young people across communities to see themselves and not just as an exclusionary tribe, but an inclusive whole, which is why I think you see the protests of today look like America, not look just like one community. And then I think the most scariest thing for many people, but exciting, is the lack of structure. You could have a demonstration that's spontaneous and is not planned. We are used to planning demonstrations with a lot of people and who's going to get the insurance and what are the parameters for the march and who are the marshals and all of those things. And it's scripted. Many of these demonstrations are spontaneous and people just say this is not right, and they hear about somebody meeting on the corner of 4th and L, and everybody show up at the corner of 4th and L, and there's your demonstration. So that's very different. And how we respond as as legacy organizations, as structured institutions, are going to really be important to provide the necessary safeguards and support for our youth energy, while at the same time not suffocate their voices and calls for justice and equality.
All right, Dr. Jones, what do you think about this youth movement?
So I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by the youth who are very smart and very strong and determined. They're not afraid. So I'm loving the courage. I'm befuddled by one thing that I've heard from some. And so I was actually, kind of doing public health support for the 619 mobilization last weekend. And as I was speaking to one of the other folks there, I was like, they were saying, okay, so what are our after action messages? And so I said, well, vote, I mean, that has to be one of the, and they were like, well, everybody's not like on that. And I was amazed. I was disheartened. They were saying, we don't need to go through those mechanisms. This was one voice, but of somebody who's organizing and, so-and-so has built this whole thing in such and such a city and it's amazing and didn't have to go through, the bureaucracy and all of this. And what I want to convey at my age is that it is important for us to stand up in a protest and be counted. What we're doing when we protest is look at my body. I am here with everybody else. These are our numbers. But I think it's that same thing when we vote, that it's important to cast our vote. It's the same thing. I count, here I am. And so I would love to hear anybody else comment on that. How do we make that even clearer? I mean, I think that sometimes maybe we in the older generations have not taught the history. We haven't taught the history of the struggle, or we haven't taught the history of who died, so that people could vote. Maybe, maybe we thought we lived through it, so they know it, and we have not been doing our job to teach the history. Maybe these young people feel so much their power, which is they have so much power, that they think they can dispense with other things. But as far as I'm concerned, we need to have an inside-outside strategy, basically. We need to be, it's a both and. If we're going to protest, we have to vote. If we're going to vote, we have to protest. I mean, it has to be all of it. And so I'm a little alarmed, having talked to people in 2016, young people who said, well, my minister told me not to vote, or it's not worth it, or anything like that. And then hearing the same thing in the context of the mobilizations right now, I'm a little concerned.
All right. I know Derek has to jump off for another Zoom call. So Stuart and Brian and Lisa, I'm going to go to Derek for one question, and that is Black Lives Matter. Why is it resonating at this point?
It's a statement of fact. It's a statement of reality, and we need to separate out that statement of reality and fact and recognize for far too many individuals, policymakers, law enforcement agencies, they have not treated the lives of Black people as if it matter, whether it's through the implementation of public policy. As you said earlier, Chairman Russell, public policy can kill you or can keep us alive. And far too often, the public policy we see, whether it's health policy, education policy, housing policy, you name the policy, it has been positioned not to allow African-American lives to matter and grow and prosper. But it's also a rallying cry now. It's a rallying cry because what we've seen on the screen, whether through social media or television, malicious approaches in which individuals take our lives and the callous nature in which they disregard our lives. And so it is a protest rally. And then, as we know, it has evolved into not only a hashtag on social media, it's evolved to multiple organizations, not one organization. There are multiple organizations that operate under a banner or a title called Black Lives Matter, which is a beautiful thing and a dangerous thing, because with a decentralized system, you have individuals like the gentleman in Florida who was not a part of the African American community, who set up a Black Lives Matter Foundation, was receiving funds under this illusion he was doing on behalf of the Black community, and it was corrupted. Or how a foreign nation used the energies behind the statement, the hashtag, and organizations to suppress democracy and mislead individuals as the Russians did during the 2016 elections. But it also is a beautiful thing for our young people to have a vehicle for voice for their expression. So it's all of those things that can be harmful, but the beautiful thing is it's a rallying cry that many of us are standing under now to move equity and democracy at this moment.
All right. Thank you, Derek. We appreciate your participation as well. I'll see you on the next go round.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. So, Lisa, what about youth?
Well, you know, I think that my colleagues have made all of the statements about youth that I would have made. But I am really struck about your question, Leon, about Black Lives Matter. Because I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 1960. I grew up in the era where the mantra was Black Power. And say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And it's almost as if, Leon, those mantras were self-affirming, right? It's almost as if Black people were trying to convince themselves in the 60s and the 70s that Black is beautiful. But I see Black Lives Matter as a recasting of that, if you will, that Black people, and in particular our Black youth, are now demanding respect. They're demanding justice. They are demanding not just the respect for their lives, but for their dreams and for their spaces and for everything else, their art and everything else that is about them. So Black Lives Matter, as I see it, isn't just about convincing ourselves that we matter. It's about demanding that others give us justice for Black lives in the broader society. And I also see it as, you know, these kids to me are saying, if you won't give it to us, we'll take it. It's as if these kids are living the lessons that were taught by Frederick Douglass. They're living the oratory that was taught by Malcolm X. They're living it and they're demanding it and they're taking it. It's, for me, a proud moment. My child is a millennial. And I think it's also a part and parcel of, I don't want to say the privilege or the entitlement, because that feels like the wrong word in this context. But our kids do have a different expectation, okay? When I was my child's age, right, I engaged with my mother in a particular, and my elders in a certain way. Right. I grew up in the era where children were seen and not heard. And these kids are saying, we will be seen and heard. Right. And I love that.
All right. So, Stuart, you've talked to some degree about the violence that the Asian community is witnessing now. What are the strategies that you think we ought to employ to begin to deal with that?
I think there's at least 3 strategies. One strategy is we have to combat the racism head on. Like I said, we have to track, but then we have to respond. We have to analyze the cases and see which cases may become real cases, as opposed to just a statistic. We need to build coalitions. Recently, I reached out to SEIU, the second largest union in the country, and they've agreed to, in their platform, to oppose anti-Asian violence. So we need to do that. The first group that really stood with the Asian Pacific Congressional Caucus was the Black Caucus. They stood up and said, we oppose anti-Asian racism. And so that, to me, is the very first thing we have to do. We have to tackle these cases, perhaps one by one, to oppose them. The second thing we have to do, and we're not different from other Americans, but we have to uplift the role that Asian Americans have played in fighting the virus. As I said, the grocery workers, the nurses. I'm on the board of Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. Half of the nurses are Filipinas. So we have to show we're fighting the virus every day. We're sacrificing our life. One of my sons is a doctor. He's fighting this all the time in Arizona. Do people recognize that that is happening? You know, there's researchers, there's Asian American groups that are giving millions of dollars of personal protective equipment to Black hospitals and Latino hospitals around the country. Who knows that? We need to promote that. And then the third thing is long-term, we need the curriculum. We need to have ethnic studies, Black studies, Latino studies, American Indian studies, and Asian American studies in all of our campuses. There's no one state in the United States that has required ethnic studies. We have to get on with that. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat history again. If I could just mention the youth, you know, one of my sons has been going down to the protests with his 5 cousins. And I think it's great, the energy, the fearlessness, the courage. But I would say 2 things that we need to help on. One is voter registration of new voters is way down. It was increasing until March. And then with the pandemic, it's really gone down. Even in California, even in New York, even in the large metropolitan, it's gone way down. We have to change that. So while we're protesting, there are structural changes we have to make to the voting. And Lisa talked about Frederick Douglass. I just think that we as seniors or as elders need to bring some of our history into these protests, because otherwise we're going to not learn from the brilliant people from the past. I just quote one thing that Frederick Douglass said in 1869. He was one of the first coalition builders. When the Democrats and the Republicans were against Chinese, he said, "What would you ask me? I would favor such immigration. I would. Would you have them naturalized?" He said, "and invested with all the rights of American citizenship?" He said, "I would. Would you allow them to vote?" "I would. I want the Asian people to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for their sake and our sake." Frederick Douglass had a vision of a new Americanism. We need to share that with our youth, because otherwise, how would they know? Because ethnic studies is not taught in our schools. How would they know? Even in the Asian community, how would they know about Vincent Chin being murdered in 1982 with the sentence of being a $3,000 fine and home on probation? They wouldn't know. They weren't even here. We need to also have an exchange with our youth leaders that we could learn from the past as well.
All right. So, Dr. Jones, talk to us about the calls for the medical community to address the role systemic racism plays in health disparities for Black and Brown people, and give some examples of policies that are best practices to dismantle systemic racism.
The amazing thing is that starting actually before the COVID-19 pandemic, so in May of 2019, the first, and I'm not going to only limit it, it's not the health department or the health people, but the first county to declare that racism is a public health crisis was Milwaukee County in Wisconsin. This is before the pandemic. Since then, there are at least 20 other counties that have made such a declaration, at least 23 cities, at least 2 states who've made that kind of declaration. But the reason I want to point out that it was Milwaukee County back in 2019, and that work had its lineage, if you would say, from the National Campaign Against Racism that we at the American Public Health Association had launched in 2016. But the reason it's important is, do you remember that the first data that we had about, that was stratified by race with regard to COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, and deaths was from Milwaukee? That is not just a happenstance. That is because you already had a community understanding that racism is real, it's a public health crisis, and then you have this pandemic washing through, and they were like, oh, we better check on our people, right? We better check and see what is going on differentially by race and ethnicity. Up until that time, that wasn't even a question. So what I would say is that these declarations, which I'm celebrating, the last time I looked, as I say, 2 states, which are Wisconsin and New Mexico, 21 counties, I know it's more than that, 23 cities, I know it's more than that. The American Public Health Association website actually is keeping a list of that, but I haven't refreshed in a day or two. But it's important for these jurisdictions to put a stake in the sand, to say we are acknowledging that racism is a public health crisis, and then not let it be just talk. So that's the challenge. King County in Washington State has a beautiful statement about, what does that mean for them? And I haven't looked at all of the other statements, but I think that this stance, racism is a public health crisis, taken not by health departments, but by jurisdictions, political jurisdictions, but understanding the health impact is the first part of the 3 tasks. It's naming racism. It has to be followed by action. And I think in each jurisdiction is going to be a different kind of action, but at least if you say it and you've said it publicly, then 6 months you can say, you can't just say, oh, well, never mind. We didn't really think that. So I think it's the first step.
Okay. Brian, do you think there's going to be an uptick, an increase in hate crimes as we move closer to the election? And
Great,
by whom, against whom?
great question. If past is prologue, yes. And let's look at some really interesting disaggregated data. And if I may, Martin Luther King said, science deals mainly with facts, religion deals mainly values. The two are not rivals. Indeed, we're entwined. And I am so privileged to be in the company of not only these wonderful folks, but many of them are literally lifelong friends like you, Leah. Thank you so much. Let's take a look. When President Obama was running for office, hate crimes spiked, not so much after, but when it looked like it was going to clinch the Democratic nomination, and in the fall before he was elected. They peaked in October. What else? Let's look at another election year, 1996. A Republican was behind in the polls, Robert Dole, but there was a contentious debate during that year along militias rising and the Olympic bombing. July 96 was the worst month since we've kept data, FBI, on hate crimes against African Americans. That year, 42% of all hate crimes were against African Americans. And what did we see as the big political thing in addition to the election, that overlay? The welfare reform bill. And we remember the stereotyping that took place in the 80s, which was given a renaissance during that debate about welfare queens and all this horrible, horrible, vile stuff. So what we often see are spikes around election time. But in 2016, we saw some interesting things. We saw an increase in crime going into the election, but it really peaked. 2016, the worst month for hate crime since 2002, the first anniversary of 9/11. And the day after Election Day was the worst day since 2003. And what do we think has happened? And I want to be careful here because they serve the people of goodwill. But to the extent that like extremist bigots think that any kind of would-be ally in the mainstream is being deposed, it seems that the hate crimes rise beforehand. Look like in 2008, we saw a crescendo of threats against candidate Obama going into the. In addition, we've seen around election times, not only spikes in hate crime, and let's do something, politics and hate crime. 3 months of the last decade through the end of 2018. November 2016, October 2018, all three of those times, we saw an increase in internet hate, and we saw plots or actual attacks. One other thing, look at this, Tree of Life, right before a midterm election, and the caravans were the big deal, and Jews were targeted because the assailant thought that they were in cahoots with the immigrants, for instance. Brexit, in Britain, we saw hate crimes increase, and we saw an assassination of a member of parliament. So we have this big storm of internet hate on the ground, and extremism. One of the things we saw, for instance, in 2019, we saw a kind of a bifurcation. The three largest cities hit nearly 2-decade highs, largely on anti-Semitic hate crimes. The number one hate crime in the three largest cities for the first time in recent memory, it's usually African-American except for New York, we saw. That's not good news because for other folks, because one group comes in and then there's a pylon. So what we've seen over the last decade, Latinos were the big, what I'm gonna call secondary target after the traditional leaders of like Jews and African Americans, right? We saw that group come in. Then we saw Muslims peak in 2016. Then we saw Latinos, anti-Latino hate crimes rise as the anti-Muslim hate crimes were going down, and now we are seeing an increase in anti-Asian crime. And what I'm concerned about is to the extent that certain groups are stereotyped or dog whistled in this process, and we're having one or two things that have been to be the political rhetoric of the season, law and order, which can eat black in the minds of white supremacists. And indeed, the president, to his discredit, posted not one, but two videos just in the last couple of days of a random black on white crime. So I remember reading that in the Klan newspapers that I used to have to get a PO box to get. So unfortunately, we are becoming more divided, and what we have found is when you have catalytic incidents like elections, we can often see spikes. The statement of leaders around those spikes can have real different effects. So for instance, when candidate Trump in December 2015, 5 days after the San Bernardino terror attack, introduced his Muslim ban proposal, hate crimes against Muslims rose an additional 23%. So what I'm saying to you is when we have it being misused, it has an effect. When President Bush spoke 6 days after 9/11, hate crimes dropped by 2/3 the next day, and we saw them drop additionally into the next year. So unfortunately, if this is prologue, election, we tend to see hate crimes spike in the second half, which we're just entering now. And we also have an increase in hateful internet chatter. And now we're seeing conspiracy theories. One last point. Some of the most divisive internet messages that were circulated in 2016 elections about police or race or immigrants and came from places like big cities in Tennessee didn't at all. They came from the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, and they tripled their racially divisive buying right into the election. So if you look at a chart, it looked like this. The ads went up, the hate crimes went up. I'm not saying that they made the hate crimes go up, but they had their finger on the pulse of what was going on and tried to seek and sow discord. And I think we're seeing that happen again. Look what we saw just recently on a major American network. Antifa was going to go out with busloads of violent people, many of whom might be young whites and people of color going into these communities. New York Times just did a story of 41 times it was hoax. You know what? Meme was from a white supremacist group that circulated in 2015 and it's still getting cycled. So that's the era that we're in when we have dozens of QAnon candidates running for public office, conspiracy theories, catalytic events, and then not only a lack of presidential leadership, but a position with respect to intergroup relations.
All right. So this pandemic has caused extensive unemployment nationally. What has been the effect on communities of color, and what does this mean for those communities? And I would add to that, and I'm going to ask this question of each of you: what can local and state human rights, human relations commissions do in their programming to deal with these kinds of issues? Lisa?
Hello, I apologize. My internet completely shut down for a little bit. I've got storms going on here. So I hope you all can hear me.
We can.
Thank you, Leon. I think there are a number of things that state human rights commissions and local human rights commissions can do. And the first thing I will admonish you to do is form coalitions. We cannot do this anti-racism, pro-justice work as islands. We have got to unite. We've got to join forces. Let me just give you a couple of examples. When I used to run the Toledo Fair Housing Center in Toledo, Ohio, our state human rights commission was running into lots of trouble. It was very conservative-led government at the state level. It was constantly defunding the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. We as private fair housing organizations and civil rights groups throughout the state joined a coalition. We created a coalition, and we lobbied for increased dollars and increased funding for the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and we got those dollars. We just saw this happen in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the local fair housing organizations throughout the country who are our members at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we lobbied Congress heavily to include into the CARES Act specific funding to go to fair housing assistance programs. Those are the state and local human rights commissions that deal with and address housing discrimination. We got millions of dollars put into the CARES Act to fund those human rights commissions in order to do anti-racism work and pro-justice work as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the reason that we were out there advocating on your behalf so that you could get increased funds is because we're in coalition together, right? We're in this alliance. And so we have to do that if we are going to really make the systemic changes that we've all been talking about. The other thing I think we need to do, Leon, is take advantage of the tools that are already there. The affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act is a requirement for every single jurisdiction. It behooves every human rights commission to actively take a part in the AFFH process. It behooves every human rights commission to push for the funds that we need to adequately and appropriate identify the impediments to fair housing, and then to develop the strategies to address those impediments to fair housing. And you work in lockstep with your local fair housing partners to achieve that. In every community, we have nonprofit health institutions, and we have health institutions that receive federal funding. Those institutions, by virtue of that fact, are required to complete a community health needs assessment, right? And so why do we have these dual tracks, these siloed tracks for the AFFH, the fair housing process, and the community health needs planning process, when the two are so interlinked and intertwined? And it is the human rights commissions that can say, hey, health partners, hey, housing partners, we need to come together and make sure there is synergy, make sure that their housing plans and the health plans are congruous So we are working in tandem with one another to address these systemic issues. We can't be doing this alone, off in our own separate corners. We've got to unite and come together. And there's so many things you guys cannot do, but this coalition building piece is something you can do. You can also help in terms of education and outreach. I don't know if it was said earlier. I saw a comment, so I think it must have been mentioned that Franklin County in Ohio has made racism a public health crisis. Do you know how powerful that is? As soon as you do that, it says to every health institution, you need to be reassessing your community health needs plan. You need to be reassessing your fair housing plan. And the commissions can raise the alarm and raise the hand in every municipality where you are and say, look what Franklin County just did. Think we need to do this in our city too.
All right, Dr. Jones, what do you think they can do?
Well, I thank you for the shout out on the racism as a public health crisis. When you did go away, we talked about the fact that 2 states, 21 counties, and 23 cities so far as of last counting, and I'm sure it's bubbling, it's happening, and so I agree with you. I am not that familiar with the role of the human rights apparatuses in local things, because that bridging that Lisa Rice was just talking about hasn't really happened in that way. I mean, you were talking about bridging housing and public health, but all of this bridging. So I really want to amen what you were saying there, that we need to create bridges between silos. Doesn't mean we have to dissolve our walls, but we must have very strong two-way multi-bridges between the silos. But what I think these agencies and groups can do is 2 things. Articulate principles for achieving health, equity, and social justice. And I would like to propose these 3 principles, which can be used across sectors and could be promoted through these things. The first is valuing all individuals and populations equally. The second is recognizing and rectifying historical injustices. And the third is providing resources according to need. Not equally, but according to need. And with those 3 principles kind of articulated and echoing across the country from so many different places, the operationalization of that includes valuing all individuals and populations equally, starts bringing community voice, especially to decision-making tables. But also when you value, you protect, you cherish, you invest in there, just think of 10 valuing words that you have, and that's what we should be doing for all individuals and communities. Recognizing and rectifying historical injustices means not only teaching full histories everywhere in our schools and everywhere, but bringing perhaps historians to decision-making bodies, the city council, the state legislature, the Congress, because if a decision-making body is trying to untie a knot, it would behoove them to know how that knot got tied. And then in terms of providing resources according to need, that requires the hard work of establishing a metric of need that everybody agrees on. So is it infant mortality rate? Is it percent unhoused? Is it wealth differentials? Whatever the metric is. But then even once you have that metric of need, you have to also have the political will to distribute resources, provide resources according to need. Because a state health officer who might get $1 million and has 5 counties, the reflex is to give each county $200,000, right? But what that health officer needs to have is the strength to say, County A, you're not getting any this year, and you might not get any next year or the next year because County E needs that money. So those 3 principles. And then I just wanted to say, the edge of my work right now, I just want to put out there because maybe you guys can help with this. I defined racism as a system of doing 2 things, structuring opportunity and assigning value. We know a lot of the structural targets for anti-racism work. So it's residential segregation. It's the funding of public schools based on local property taxes. It's the disproportionate incarceration of folks, Black and brown men and women in our prisons. It's the foster care system. It's so many things. It's the police departments. But we have not yet articulated the values targets. So I just want to quickly propose to the group, and maybe this work could be taken up by these organizations, 7 values targets. One, we in this nation are so narrowly focused on the individual that it makes systems and structures invisible or seem to be irrelevant. 2, we are ahistorical and we act as if the present were disconnected from the past and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. 3, we endorse the myth of meritocracy, the story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you will make it. And I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard, although we have prominent examples of people who made it who have not. But even as I acknowledge that most people who have made it have worked hard, there are many, many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and is being perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all of these systems of structured inequity. And to the extent that we deny racism, we endorse the myth of meritocracy, and you can deny racism by saying, I don't think racism exists, or you can deny racism by never saying the word. Because if you never say the word racism in the context of widespread denial, you're complicit with that denial. Very quickly, the 4th one is the myth of a zero-sum game, that if you gain, I lose. The 5th is limited future orientation. The parts of the future we can touch right now are the children and the planet. In our decision making, we don't have a 7 generations kind of idea about the impact of our decisions like many American Indian nations do. And many East African groups, the greeting is not, hey, how you doing, but how are the children, hoping to get the response, all the children are well. And we never ask the question in this country, how are the children? Furthermore, if we did, we would not get the answer that all the children are well. And we have a usurious relationship with the planet. The 6th is the myth of American exceptionalism, which makes us not look for answers or ideas outside of the US. And the 7th is white supremacist ideology. The myth that there's a hierarchy of human valuation by race, and the further myth that if there were such a hierarchy, that white people would be at the top as the ideal and the norm. But this myth, this white supremacist ideology, gives white people a sense of entitlement. It results directly in the dehumanization of people of color, and it has fostered, fueled the fear at the browning of America that is currently underlying our politics. And to the extent that the human rights organizations could figure out what is their role in addressing any one of these 7 values targets in terms of anti-racism or these cultural or societal barriers to achieving health equity and social justice, I would be very pleased to hear of that.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Stuart, Dr. Jones just gave us a litany of things, but I'd like to zero in for a minute on the zero-sum game question. How would you respond? And I know that you have heard it, when people say, well, if we have affirmative action, that's going to benefit Asians versus Blacks versus, or women versus somebody else, or somebody else versus somebody else. The if you advance, I lose theory. How do you respond to that?
I think that 2 main points. One is that by having affirmative action, we all benefit. Obviously, we're at a moment where there's more openness to the interests and demands of the Black community. So we need to ride that and promote that right now, because there is that openness to understand the disparities in our society. But secondly, I would say affirmative action benefits Asian Americans, because Asian Americans, when they get into the workplace, are not going to be promoted on test scores. They're going to be promoted because they could work well with a diverse group of people. And so having diverse classes is a benefit to Asian American students. Furthermore, there are a number of cases that we worked on, the Harvard case on the pro-affirmative action side. This is a time where good affirmative action programs recognize the hardship and discrimination that Asians have gone through too. Following up with how African Americans and Blacks are looked at, Asian Americans actually can benefit from this too. And the second main point I would say, to your point about zero-sum game, Asian Americans who are concerned about higher education should be fighting to expand the opportunities for everybody. So college for all, however it's funded is a different point, but college for all is a reality for Americans of all backgrounds. If you do not do that, and our colleges are shrinking in terms of the people that they're admitting, shrinking in terms of because of the coronavirus, we're doing a disservice to our own children. We should be at the forefront of fighting for expanded opportunities now more than ever. And that to me is the larger question. In fact, we started a coalition in California called College for All. So, you know, we have been expanding opportunities for people of color, but, you know, that in the name, that's what we're aiming for, college for all, you know, and that to me is the answer to the zero-sum game, because you cannot look at it as one group benefiting and another group losing. It really has to be expanding the opportunities for all. And so that's our approach. You know, to your question about what human relations commissions can do, I just wanted to address that briefly. I think there's a lot of groups. Obviously, there's new groups that are forming, but there's a lot of groups that are really disconnected in the areas of civil rights even. The groups are starting to want to connect, but they're not connected. In the areas of health, it's clear that African Americans, Latinos, Pacific Islanders, and American Indians are being disproportionately affected by the coronavirus. I think it's very important to connect the health groups or people interested in health to understand, what do you do about that? What do you do about the disproportionate impact? What are the demands around health coverage, health care that makes sense to these affected communities? And then the third area I'll just briefly mention is ethnic studies. How can Human Relations Commission bring together the various parties on the ethnic studies so we could actually have states pass laws that mandate ethnic studies across the board? And, you know, we're working on the Asian American curriculum, but others are working on the Black curriculum. Others are working on the Latino curriculum. That should all be coming together. But I think that the Human Relations Commissions are uniquely situated to bring people together to, you know, Lisa and Dr. Jones's point about what the Human Relations Commissions can do. I see the connectional work, the coalition building as something that nobody else is poised to really do in our communities.
All right. Brian, again, sticking with the zero-sum game. In your work, you're analyzing what's going on. To what extent do you see the zero-sum game, the misinformation created by that, used to justify hate crime?
Oh gosh, you know, I just got an email not too long ago that said, how come you're focusing on these people who are being attacked when those people are being attacked? And unfortunately, we see this kind of gotcha game of which I was talking about in the New York Times just the other day, and that was that even after Bubba Wallace's case became public and people were horrified and said, hey, let's see what the investigation shows. What did they do? They tried to malign the victim. And we have an industry now, where folks are suggesting that the majority of hate crimes, or some significant number, are hoaxes. So what we try to do is, as Dr. King said, you know, science has value along with values as well. And to get our ducks in a row with data so that we can support our public policy partners in groups like IAOHRA, ACP, and others. Because what we're seeing happening today with the internet is there is a whole ecosystem, not only of white supremacy, but a diet white supremacy. And that has caused, I think, inroads into the mainstream. Just bear with me for 1 second. In 2016, we only saw 3 white supremacist homicides. But what did we see during 16 and 17? We saw inroads of white supremacists into the public policy arena. And an example of that was we saw more white nationalists, public demonstrations of 75 or more in the 2.5 years leading just into and after Charlottesville, the previous 10 to 15 years combined. Then after Charlottesville, when these hate groups were exposed for exactly what they were, what we saw was homicides started going up, and we saw a shift to the internet as well as to these small cells of violent white supremacists and these killers. So I guess my answer would be to try and leverage data, whether we're talking about affirmative action, whether we're talking about white supremacy, because data is our friend when it's honestly and earnestly presented. Because there is, as Judge Higginbotham taught me about the Brown versus Board of Education decision, he said that was the first time that the Supreme Court looked at social science data. And what I think we have to do is partner, universities, we have to do this job too, is partner with our friends in the Human Relations Commissions, partners with our friends in the churches, partner with our friends who are in the LGBT community, and create localized, coalesced networks, just like the darn white supremacists do. But we have the imprimatur of a history of civil rights, which they do not.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to ask that if any of our participants, those who are viewing the panel, have questions, that they start to add those questions to the Q&A section. And I'm going to ask if Robin, you want to come back online now and join us. One question that's already out there, and I'll ask particularly Lisa and Dr. Jones to take this on head on. Is there a difference between systemic racism and systematic racism, or is it just semantics? Either one of you can jump in.
I want to jump first. So I actually haven't been hearing systematic, but what I have to say is systemic is what I use because I'm understanding racism as a system, not an individual character flaw, not a personal moral feeling, not even white supremacist culture, because it's not a culture. I mean, white supremacist culture is part of it. That's the values part of it, but it also has the structural part and not a psychiatric illness. So it's a system. So that's why I would say systemic racism. Sometimes you'll hear structural racism. That's the structure piece, but the values piece is also part of the system. So when I define racism as a system of structuring opportunity, the structural piece, and assigning value, which we haven't been doing a lot of thinking on. That was the 7 things that I just gave you right there. So that's what I say. Systematic racism, well, that's what we have too. I mean, it is systematic. It's so entrenched in everything, but I actually haven't been using or heard that term.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got the same answer. I mean, the 2 words can be used interchangeably, but if you want people to readily understand what you are saying, if you say systemic racism or structural racism, people get that. If you use the word systematic, people may not understand what you're talking about because those 2 words, systemic and structural, are more commonly used.
Okay. Brian or Stuart, any comment on that question?
I agree with the past comments.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think that people are ignorant about is when we talk about systemic racism, we're not a particular person who's in that system necessarily is aggressively intending for it. But what we have to do, and we all do, as we look at police departments, I think what we also have to do is take opportunity and not let it go. To look at, as we've been saying, voting, education, healthcare, and the disproportionate outcomes that burden certain communities are the most vulnerable. And I think that's where academia can provide a unique partnership, because we have a diverse group of subject matter experts who talk about health and voting and criminal justice and a variety of things that can aid folks who may not have a background in studies, but roll up their sleeves in getting the job done. And I think we, if I may, those of us in the ivory towers have to roll up our sleeves, march with folks, talk with folks, show up at the HRCs, and make not only our research available, but our academic community available as well, in part of a sustained movement. Because if it's just one-off, what we're gonna have, bear with me. Reverend Vivian gave me a very important many years ago when I got the opportunity to meet him after representing his group. And he said, Brian, back in the 60s, we knew where the lines were. And I think that's what the horrible lynching of George Floyd gave us. In other words, this is a line. But what ends up happening, what Reverend Vivian said, he said, the tough thing is going to be for your generation, Brian. And I said, why, Reverend Vivian? You put your life on the line and the Voting Rights Act was passed shortly thereafter. And he said, the people today are more sophisticated with a shell game that they're doing to obfuscate what the eyes on the prize actually are. And that lesson has never left me. Sustained work, but where we get together folks of different expertise, different skill sets, working for the same goal and sustaining it. And that is the patience part that may be the toughest. And I guess the next step is getting together in our communities and encourage people to vote for those people who have the same values of what Dr. Martin Luther King had.
May I jump
I can just add on a little bit more, because I want to make the point more clear. So look, from before the formation of the United States of America, right? We're talking colonialism, the colonial period. Think about it. Every law, almost every single law that dealt with housing, economics, lending, resources, resource allocation, every law was racialized. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Indian Removal Act, all of the slave codes, even the US Constitution that said that Black people are 3/5 of a person, to Dr. Jones's point about valuing this, right? Every law, Black people cannot, Black people shall not. If your grandfather was a slave, you cannot vote. All of these laws were racialized. So they were either racist, explicitly, directly racist in the text of the statute, or there were racialized policies used in the implementation of those laws. Systemic redlining that was created by the homeowners loan corporation system and picked up and embedded in the underwriting policies of the Federal Housing Administration are another example of that. So what happened was all of these laws sort of converged, these policies converged to create these systems of racism and inequality, residential segregation, the dual credit market, segregated schools, and so forth and so on. So what happened was in the 1960s and 1970s, when we passed our civil rights laws, what we said in those civil rights statutes is, going forward, you cannot make a decision about whether you can hire this person or that person, or whether you'll give this person a housing opportunity based on their race or their national origin, et cetera, right? So that's the individual action that Dr. Jones alluded to, but we left the systems of racism in place. We passed the Fair Housing Act, but we left residential segregation in place, right? We passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, but we left the dual credit market in place, right? These systems were designed to create and provide opportunities for white people while simultaneously closing off and disclosing opportunities for people of color. And the systems that are still in place today, they're continuing to do their job, right? And every year when we get the HMDA data that says we still have redlining in America, we still have a disproportionality when it comes to who's getting access to mortgage credit. Every year the data says the same thing, and every year we clutch our pearls and say, oh my God, how is this happening? Well, it's happening, the system is doing what it was designed to do, which is why we have to deconstruct, dismantle it, and build new systems that perpetuate opportunity and fairness.
And I need to jump in on top of that. Yes, so you just go, girl. that is amazing. And so I do storytelling. So I'm first going to say that the most profound impacts of racism happen without bias. They happen through inaction in the face of need, as Lisa Rice just illustrated. But the story that helps us understand why we need to be talking about systemic racism, especially in contrast to individual attitudes and that kind of thing. Imagine racism is a cement factory, spewing cement dust. And anybody who's around that cement factory for any amount of time is going to have cement dust in their lungs. And that cement dust in their lungs might affect different ones of us differently. Maybe the cement dust in my lungs makes me devalue myself, whereas the cement dust in somebody else's lungs makes them, lean on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But all of us will have some kind of cement dust. The issue is, do we want to create machines that scan how much cement dust you have, and then, if you have too much, then you're going to go to prison? Or do we even want to create machines that extract the cement dust out of you but leaves the factory still spewing? What we really need to do is acknowledge that there is a system. There is this cement factory spewing cement dust. The minute I recognize that, I need to put on my gas mask. That is, I need to start my anti-racist journey. That gas mask is not going to take all the cement dust out of my lungs that's already there, but it's going to keep more going in. Furthermore, every time I look at myself or have that gas mask on, I am remembering something about the cement dust. And other people who see me are like, hey, Kamara, why do you have a gas mask on? I said, there's a cement factory spewing cement dust. So then more and more of us put on this as we become actively anti-racist in an individual level. And when there are enough of us, then we go into the factory and we shut it down. That is the importance of talking about systemic racism. It's not, whenever I say the word racism, I am not talking about who's racist and who's not. I am never trying to divide the room into how much cement dust you have in your lungs, because actually, even though you become part of the problem when it's in your actions sometimes, the real problem is the factory, is the system, is that thing. And so that is how we have to be so clear.
Thank you.
I absolutely believe that's the appropriate place to end and turn it over to Robin to sum up. I will say, for those of you who are participating and who've hung in here, this session is recorded and will be available on the IAOHRA website. I think during the session, our panelists have all provided you with information, definitions that they've used, and how to get in touch with them. Lisa, you can do that too. I think I've been sort of tracking folks or trying to, but all of them are available. And as for the person who asked who is the we and who are the they, well, we are the human rights and human relations folks who have as a responsibility dealing with these issues in our communities. And they is everybody else, and we have a responsibility to help them become us. So with that, Robin, thank you for the opportunity to moderate this panel.
Thank you so much, Leon. I just want to thank you as moderator on behalf of all of us at IAOHRA and in the audience, and especially all of the guests who've just been brilliant with your insights and inspiration. I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the things that I think are real takeaways for our member organizations. First of all, I think, Leon, you talked about the benign neglect that many of our commissions and agencies face. I just want to highlight that because we are in the middle of a great crisis, as you pointed out, and we are called upon to push back against that benign neglect. Derek Johnson talked about that the structural racism that people are waking to in this country, it's not just about social conditions, it's about the economics and making corporations understand that it's bad business to be racist and to support structural racism. He also raised the important point about the lack of accountability of Facebook, which is something that so many people live by that we all use, but yet is allowed to support white supremacists who recruit through Facebook and carry out their violence. He also stressed the importance of the vote in November. He talked about the power of youth. And most importantly, he stressed that public policy can kill you or keep you alive, put in very powerful, dire terms. So I want to then say that Catherine Lehman, our chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, talked about the things that the Civil Rights Commission has done to make sure that the legislation in Congress includes the kinds of changes that they have recommended around police use of force, and that they're going to continue to play a huge role around voting rights, which is one of their main mandates. And so we look to them to continue to be a unifying voice in the country around that. Dr. Jones was brilliant in talking about so many things. I want to highlight a few. She said so much I can't cover it here, but the importance of international bodies like the International Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. That is actually a treaty that is like our Constitution, adopted by this country, one of the few international human rights treaties, and she calls upon us to use that platform to challenge the structural racism that we have to dismantle in this country. She talks about the importance of our commissions and agencies declaring racism as a public health crisis, and the power of us breaking down the silos that can really help to strengthen our struggle. She laid out so many wonderful definitions and principles that I know she has shared on the chat, and unfortunately don't have the time to go in now, but really do follow up on them. Stuart talked about the challenges facing the Asian American community, that is both coronavirus, the challenge to structural racism, and the police abuse that we see through the movement for Black Lives Matter, and that the need for really making systemic changes through curriculum, and how critical that is, because without changing what people learn every day in school, we're not going to see changes in the way we understand the historical nature of racism and how we have to dismantle it. He talked about 3 strategies about confronting racism, to building coalitions, including with labor unions, and the fact that we need to come together as coalitions to really demand ethnic studies across the board. He also made some comments about affirmative action that I think are really important for our communities, that we really need to work together around that issue as well. And this is an amazing opportunity now to really reopen that. It's happening here in California, and that's something that we need to be a part of. He talked about as well the importance of just the connectional work that the HRCs have to do, and that's a special role that we have. Brian shared with us so much. The things that jumped out to me was the decline, 38% decline in hate crime prosecutions that have happened in this last period. He talked about the importance of the commissions intersecting with not only communities, but with the Justice Department Community Relations Service and IAOHRA and NARO, which is our sister organization, the National Association of Human Rights Workers. He talked about hate crimes rising in many cities, and that yes, as we approach these elections, hate crimes are going to rise. And so we have to keep that in mind as we move forward in not only preparing ourselves for that, but proactively taking stances that are going to push back on that, on the kind of rhetoric that is fueling hate, as well as really responding quickly when it does happen. Lisa Rice really was wonderful in identifying the two fundamental changes that we need to tackle, which is dismantling structural racism and building out new structures that promote equity, and the fact that we have to change culture. She talked about the insidiousness of technology, and that often we see it as being neutral, but in fact it's not benign, and that in many cases it breeds and amplifies bias, and we have to pay attention to that, especially with Facebook and other forms of social media. And I think that she made some beautiful points about that the youth movement of today, the Black Power movement, is like the Black Power movement of before, that it's not just self-affirming, but it's actually demanding respect and justice. So I want to just at this point say that, you know, we are obviously facing an extraordinary crossroads, a moment in history that is unlike any other. And I think what we're being called by all of the speakers to do is to take extraordinary efforts to change what we are seeing as the fundamental building blocks of racism, to really dismantle it piece by piece, and to not let this opportunity pass. I want to say that, you know, we at IAOHRA, we're in that unique position of being the agencies that are really the consciences of our governments. We need to remind our governments that the most fundamental responsibility that we have, that it has, is to protect and fulfill the civil and human rights of everyone, to respect the dignity of every human being, and to make that real through changes that integrate equity into our DNA, that integrate it into our operations, into our policies and practices. It's no longer a siloed goal. It needs to be part of every goal. It needs to be one of the mainstays of our government's actions and plans, strategic goals. And that's something that we as IAOHRA are in a unique position to do. So I hope, I'm gonna make a pitch for IAOHRA, because as Leon said, we often suffer from benign neglect and worse. Some of our agencies are targeted by hostile governments. And we need to come together to be part of this network, to connect, learn, grow, and take action to fight back. So I urge you to go to our website, iaohra.org, and let us know if you want to join us, our network, and you want to stay in touch. We have, in fact, another town hall planned that's going to be in August, when we are hoping to have our conference here in Los Angeles, but due to the pandemic, it's not going to happen. But we hope that you will protect that time in August, the week of August 11th, from vacation time. And so you'll be able to continue this conversation focused on different aspects of where we need to really move forward if we want to make sure that the changes of today are going to hold, and we seize the opportunities that we have at this moment. Each of us clearly has the power to bring us closer, much closer to the world we need to be. And it's obviously very hard, but I will say for myself, gratifying work, but it's in our DNA as individuals. Everyone on this call is here because it's part of who we are. And we need to continue to do that, to really find the joy as well, keep love and community and compassion at the core of our actions, and doing this together, breaking down the silos, coming together as coalitions. So on that note, I just want to again thank all of you for not just being with us, but our panelists for sharing their wisdom and insights. And I want to, on behalf of the board, I want to say thank you to Jim Stowe, who has been the lead in putting this together, as well as our magnificent planning committee and board, Lisa Sims, Angie Rush, so many others that have made this possible. So with that, thank you everyone. Take care, be safe, and stay strong.
Right.